I like that.
Would somebody like to be my slide person?
So I'm holding it together.
Okay guys, so today we're going to be talking about social change. Now, there are a couple things I want you to keep in mind while we talk about this. So first of all, there are ongoing changes that are driving these social changes. So first of all, we've got inflation. We've got rising population. And these are themselves having serious impacts. Inflation, among other things, is leading to inequality in the countryside. Rising population is leading to greater inequality in cities, as well as leading to urbanization. The reason that this is happening is because people in the countryside are leaving the crowded countryside to look for work in the cities. What is another word for inflation starting to happen in Europe? What's the price revolution? The price revolution is really just inflation starts happening. Inequality in the countryside is happening because big farmers that can produce a surplus can make a lot of money. They actually benefit from the rising price of grain, whereas anybody who has to buy grain on the market is going to lose out because they're going to be spending more and more of their money just buying foodstuffs. Okay. Why is inequality in the city happening as more and more people from the countryside flood into the city? Think about it.
What was the question?
So inequality in cities is also getting worse. Basically, from 1500 to 1650, inequality is getting worse all across the board in Europe. In the countryside, it's happening because of inflation, as big farmers are able to buy up the best land, and poor farmers are forced to scratch out a meager existence. In the cities, inequality is also getting worse. Who controls privilege and power in the cities? The guilds.
Oh, and the guilds are very exclusive?
And the guilds are becoming more and more exclusive as more and more people flood into the cities. And so the guilds are basically pulling up the ladders and saying like, no, 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 we're the only ones who get the good jobs. You can be a street sweeper.
Are the guilds like how Ivy Leagues work today?
So I think that the guilds back in the 1600s were working the way Ivy League schools are working today. They're a very limited and selective group that can decide who gets in and who gets out. And there's more people than ever today trying to get into the fancy colleges. Just like in the 1600s and 1700s, there were more people than ever trying to make it big in the city. But the number of guilds isn't going up. Yes?
Wait, so the structure of a guild is the guild master, the journeyman, the apprentice, and then the lower guys?
Well, so there are people who, there's nobody in a guild lower than an apprentice. The apprentice are like teenage kids who do all the dirty work. They don't really get paid very much. You get room and board, but you also get the promise that eventually you'll be a journeyman. And journeymen make a decent living. And if you become a journeyman, then you eventually have the opportunity to become a master. At least that's, in theory, the case. Well, the number of master positions are actually quite limited. Yes, Ahmed?
Were the journeymen considered like lower class?
They would actually be kind of middle class within the city structure. But from a noble person's point of view, literally everybody in the cities, in the guilds, are lower class. They're all commoners, working with their hands, actually being useful. It's disgusting. Yes, Ethan?
But do they live like do they live comfortably? Like, can they afford?
It would depend on your guild and like the profession that you were in. But the journeymen live reasonably well compared to other people. So like obviously compared to the masters, they're still hard off and they resent the masters. That's what the Great Cat Massacre is about. But they have the money if they need to go to a tavern and buy like a big roast and have a feast every once in a while. Or, they can afford decent housing in the city. Unlike the guildless day laborers who live in shacks and, spend most of their money just obtaining their daily bread. So privilege during this time period is it's all relative, right? So the journeymen are still living in what we would consider to be dire poverty, but they're at least living at like a reasonable level of like biological security. They've got enough money to buy meat every once in a while. They can buy shoes and pants. Yeah, Ryan?
So like in the social hierarchy, so would they be like similar to the point of like farm B? Like last time you did the little chart thing?
Oh yeah, sure. If you wanted to like have like a parallel structure, so they're so like the masters would be like the big landowners, and then the journeymen would be like they're hanging in there, they're okay, they're making ends meet, and then the apprentices and the ungilded workers are like have limited life expectancies. That's how bad.
They wouldn't always survive.
They wouldn't always survive. They'd be poorly nourished. In hard times, they would be eating bread mixed with sand, or sawdust. And because of this poor nutrition, they're also much more susceptible to dying from various diseases. Yes?
How would you compare like the laborers in this time period to the laborers in the Industrial Revolution?
Interesting.
Election.
That's a good question. I would say that the lowest class workers in cities during this time period are probably actually poorer than the workers during the Industrial Revolution, but they have a lot of interesting perks that the workers in the Industrial Revolution lose. There's a really cool essay that I read from a social historian, a guy named E.P. Thompson, who talks about the disciplining of the English working class to make them into factory workers. Is the average apprentice in a pre-industrial workshop would show up whenever he wanted, he would take long breaks during the day, and he wouldn't actually get that much work done. The average early modern town had like 40% of the work days were holidays, including sometimes they would just all take Monday off. They called it, in Catholic countries, they'd call it Saint Monday as a holiday. So just like you guys pressing for a 3-day weekend, a lot of pre-industrial workers just didn't actually work that hard. They'd show up, they'd do work for a couple hours, and then they'd go and they would drink in the tavern. In the Industrial Revolution, factory owners started to implement series of incentives to get people to work super hard, including having a clock that told them when they had to start and when they had to stop working, and you would be penalized if you weren't at your workstation at a certain time. That is why early Luddites who were breaking industrial tools and destroying factories, the most commonly attacked item in the whole factory was the clock. Because if there was no clock, you couldn't be late. Yes, Evan.
Wasn't it that the invention of the clock were responsible for the end of like the 2-set sleep cycle? Because like people used to sleep 4 hours, wake up for an hour, and then go back to sleep for 4 hours again.
I have never heard of that. You can send me a link to it. I'll check it out.
Okay.
On it?
I have a question. Wait, so what workers are concerning? You're saying like industrial workers in the cities, or like farmers and stuff?
Wait, I was distracted. Say that again?
Like industrial workers in the cities in like the 1600s?
So I think Ethan was talking about the difference between urban workers pre-industrial revolution, and then revolution, and then urban workers during the early industrial revolution. So I was thinking of like pre-industrial manufacturers, guys who were like making shoes, or a blacksmith, or an old style weaver, or whatever, versus people working in the mills in like Manchester in 1820. And I think there's actually pretty good evidence that wages for factory workers do go up. the factories are actually offering better pay than what people could get doing other jobs, which is why they're able to get thousands of people to work in horrifying, dangerous, and unhealthy conditions. The issue is that there are just so many jobless, poor urban dwellers by the year 1800 that you can offer 10 cents a day with no health insurance and the risk of getting your arm lopped off. And people are like, I'll take it. 16-hour days? That's fine. I don't have anything to do anyway. Do we get a lunch break? No? That's fine. I don't have any food anyway. And so this process of increasing urbanization and increasing inequality is going to be one of the very long-term causes of the Industrial Revolution. It's like, as the population of Europe grows, there's this just larger and larger mass of mostly unemployed, poor urban people. And the British entrepreneurs are going to realize a way to make money off of these people, which is putting them to work in factories. They're going to take these unproductive citizens who are at risk of starving to death and give them a wage that is enough for them to buy clothes and bread and turn them into the most productive workforce in human history. Yes, on it.
Wait, wouldn't that? Never mind.
Okay, cool. Come here.
Was another major factor in people moving to the cities have to do with like enclosure?
Enclosure is going to happen a little bit later, but that will be a big factor. In the late 1700s, especially in Britain, the common fields will be sold off. And then all of the smallest farmers who were barely eking by with like a couple of goats and chickens, and maybe like an illegal wheat field somewhere in the commons, are going to have nothing left to do and are going to give up and move to the cities. So you're eventually going to reach this like critical mass of more or less propertyless people in the urban setting. And then that's going to provide cheap labor to make the early factories work. Okay, let's go on to the first slide, shall we? So today we're going to be looking at how the traditional medieval hierarchy of the three estates changes. So one thing that's important to keep in mind is there's a key difference between status and class. Status has to do with all of the privileges that you get in society. And so status can have to do with how much money you have, but it also has to do with any other legal or extra-legal benefits that you get. So being a nobleman comes with a lot of status. Being a nobleman means you get all sorts of cool privileges. You can literally punch a commoner, and the commoner probably deserved it. Yeah, you could punch a commoner and say that he insulted you and then have him arrested. That is a non-monetary benefit of being a nobleman in France. Being in the clergy came with a ton of crazy benefits, including the fact that you were tax exempt. But also, if you ever got in trouble, you could be tried in special church courts that were very lenient. This comes up in the last duel. A guy is accused of rape, and one of his options is just to join the church. And if you join the church, then you won't be prosecuted, because the church takes care of its people. You should watch it. It's so good. You could.
You should. I remember when my sister was in high school, like she got like movie slips and watched an R-rated movie. You should just do that and watch the movie.
It's really R-rated. Okay, like it's super
I
R-rated.
mean, the movie slips say that.
All right, but guys, let's keep going. So that is status. Status is kind of like all of the benefits you get from being a particular type of person. Class, on the other hand, specifically has to do with economic privileges. So upper class, middle class, and lower class has to do with how much money you have. In the United States today, I would say that class and status have kind of combined together. Is like the upper class people in the United States today are mostly just the jobs that make the most money. But there are some jobs that come with status benefits where you don't actually make that much money. So like being a musician is like kind of cool, and like people are gonna be like dope. But you're probably not gonna make a ton of money as a musician unless you like hit it really big, or like, yeah. Anyway, but so back in the old-fashioned medieval society, status was huge. There were tons and tons and tons of literally written down rules that gave benefits to the clergy and the nobility. There were rules about how much silk and how much velvet you could wear. Nobles were allowed to wear as much velvet and silk as they wanted to. And if they saw a commoner wearing too much silk, they could report that, and that commoner could be fined or even publicly punished, like stocks or beatings and stuff like that. Nobles were allowed to carry a sword in public. Commoners were not. Though commoners were allowed to carry knives. So one thing that happened in Germany is commoners just started carrying around like 4-foot-long knives. Oh, it's a knife. It's only got one edge. Yes.
Wait, wouldn't it have been like in the early stages of the Renaissance, like very rich, very rich merchants would like just defy the order and just pay the fine because they're stuck.
Because they could,
Yeah.
right? And that's one of the whole things that's going on in the Renaissance is you have people of very high class, these like wool merchants and bankers, who lack status because they're commoners, and they're trying to convert their money into status. Like once you get rich, the next thing you want is prestige. You want to be respected by the people around you. Okay, so anyway, I say that all just to point out that back in the Middle Ages, status and class kind of lined up. The church and the nobles were high status and they were the richest people, and the commoners were the lowest status and the poorest. That's how it was back in like 1300. By 1600, though, it's going to get all mixed up. And then it's going to take Europe a while to realign in a way that makes sense. Yes, Ahmed?
Wait, when was like an actual portable gun invented?
A portable gun?
Like where they like instead of like carrying like a sword like this, they could just like pull it like this and do this.
There were pistols in the 1600s. They weren't very accurate or powerful, but they did exist.
Were they, like,
By the 1700s, you had the little like dueling flintlock pistols that you're familiar with. Okay, so of course the king is at the top of the status hierarchy, and he is picked by the church and is the highest ranking of nobles. The highest status group of all would be the clergy. Among other cool benefits, they don't have to pay taxes, and they have legal immunity. They can only be prosecuted by the church. They cannot be prosecuted by civil authorities. And the church is very lenient on its own members. The second estate is then the nobility. They also are largely tax exempt. Mostly what they do is they just have to tax the commoners and then give a lot of that tax money up, but that's not really theirs anyway, it's the king's. They also have access to the best governmental positions, being a general, being a tax collector, being a judge. All of those privileges go straight to the nobles. They also get some political representation. In France, in Germany, and in England, there are representative bodies. In England, it's called parliament. In Germany, there's like councils of all the nobles who elect the emperor. And in France, there's the Estates General, which privileges the nobles and the clergy over the commoners, which is famous for the role that it plays in the French Revolution. And then last of all, there's the third estate. And the third estate pays the taxes, does most of the actual manual labor, and then receives, as a reward, services from the elite class. That is, military protection from the nobles, and they get to go to heaven from the church. That was the old medieval structure. Commoners were basically supposed to be small-scale craftsmen and farmers living in the countryside. The medieval towns did not even really fit into this three-part structure. The thing that's going to mess this all up is the commoners are going to become super wealthy, beginning with the bankers and merchants of the Renaissance, as towns and as trade become more significant. And this is going to lead to new groups that don't really fit into this categorization. Here are two fancy nobles wearing a bunch of silk, and he's carrying a sword. All right, next. So during this time period of 1500 to 1650, you see the rise of new elites. Basically, new ways for commoners to raise themselves up in status. So the old system of hierarchy continues to exist, but new wealthy classes, that is like new middle class groups, are going to carve out little spots for themselves above the commoners. One really interesting group is the English gentry. The English gentry are going to be very important. Basically, these guys are the rich peasants that we talked about back on Thursday. These are the guys who know what they're doing and who have managed to buy up a whole bunch of farmland from their neighbors. These are farmers who are wealthy enough after taxes to live as if they were nobles. They can afford a fancy house, they can afford hunting hounds and leisure activities of various types and fancy clothes. They can educate their children to speak French and Latin. So, in England, this was not only accepted, this was encouraged. The English are the most accepting of commoners moving up in the world. And so, basically, in England, if you were rich enough to act like a nobleman, you would be treated as if you were almost as good as the old-fashioned aristocracy. You get to be like a pseudo-noble. And this class is known as the gentry, the genteel folk, the gentlemen and gentlewomen. And in England, you see a split in the commoners, where the vast majority of commoners are poor, landless workers who work for the gentry. The gentlemen hire you to take care of his pigs, clean his house, mend his shoes. Yes?
So is this kind of like the emergence of like the upper middle class kind of thing?
Yeah, I would call the English gentry the rural middle class of England. There's like massive aristocratic estates ruled by dukes and counts. But underneath them, there's like thousands of gentlemen who own a couple hundred acres and have a reasonable revenue and are invested in the British East India Company, so they're making money that way. And they can live reasonably leisurely, luxurious lives. Nowhere near the level of the aristocrats, but still way above the dirt poor peasants who now work for them, who are now just their employees. Yes?
I know you explained this like last week, but I remember the structure. So you said they freed the serfs, and then the serfs like got property. How'd they get the property? Were they working as tenants under the nobility?
Right. So how it would work is there would be a big noble landlord who would own most of the land. And then he would have peasants that worked on his land, and they would rent chunks of land long term. And then they would, so there would be a contract between you and the Lord where you'd be like, I have the right to work on this land for the next 100 years, and this right will go on to my heirs. And as payment for working this land, I will pay 20% of the yield to you. That'd be how it works. So technically that land is part of the Duke's domain, but it's being worked by peasants, who kind of function like sharecroppers almost. But you can still buy up parcels to add to your land that you can work. And each parcel would have different amounts of taxes that went to different people. So you might have a couple parcels that are part of the estate of, the Duke, and then you'd have a couple parcels that are part of the estate of this monastery over here, you'd like renting from them. And then you might also, if you're lucky, be able to buy up land that you would just own outright, and then you'd only pay taxes to the king on it. It's the legal structures of medieval states are incredible messes. If you drew out all the legal connections that even like a medium-sized farm had to deal with. You pay like 10% to the church, and then you pay 5% on this half of your land to this count, and then 12% on this land to that account. It's a total mess.
Wait, was there any like gentry like forming their own militias like to combat like the nobilities like dukes and squires to, like
No,
govern you?
that does not happen in England. However, during the English Civil War, which we'll look at in just a little bit, you see a split between the old-fashioned, mostly Catholic, higher aristocracy on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the gentry mostly support Parliament and a more Protestant-style interpretation of the Anglican Church. So you're going to see a split in the political loyalties between the high old aristocracy and the gentry during the English Civil War. Yes?
Wait, when is the English Civil War?
It's in the 1640s. We'll talk about it very soon. All right, so anyway, that's the English gentry. Is basically England allows for a sort of middle-class rural group to form, and they give these folks new responsibilities and privileges. So the gentry are allowed to dress like gentlemen, but they are also expected to play a role in local government. So the gentry might be required to serve as like local sheriffs, or participate on like local road maintenance councils or something like that. So like limited local government stuff. Also, the gentry get to participate in Parliament. Any wealthy commoner gets to vote for the House of Commons. So the gentry get limited privileges, that including political privileges, but also are given certain responsibilities that used to be the responsibility of the local nobility. This is really important. England allows for commoners to rise up and to occupy a sort of middle rung within society. There's a lot of openness to social mobility in England. In France, that is not the case. In France, the nobles are incredibly prejudiced against commoners. They literally view themselves as a different type of person than the commoners. The blue bloods, the old-fashioned aristocrats. So if you want to have any sort of status or respect in France, you need to be a noble. However, as the French state expands, it realizes that it needs more people to fill important government positions. There are not enough intelligent nobles to fill all of the positions necessary. All of the officers in the army, plus all of the tax collectors, all of the bureaucrats, all of the judges, all of the lawyers, they need educated people to fill these roles as the French state expands. So the French invent a new type of nobility. The old-fashioned military sorts of nobles are called the nobility of the sword. And these are the people who dominate the military. Generals, colonels, captains, majors, admirals. Those are all still super old-fashioned, old-school, conservative, can trace their lineage back to Charlemagne nobles. But you can become a noble in France now. A commoner can become a noble. So if you enter government service and you do a really great job working for the government, you can eventually be offered the opportunity to buy a title of nobility. And this will then give you access to all sorts of sweet jobs that are the second branch of the French nobility, the nobility of the robe. So new nobles cannot become nobles of the sword, but they can become nobility of the robe. They can become clerks, they can become judges, they can become government bureaucrats, which come with awesome salaries. This guy is a French noble of the robe. They're called nobles of the robe because judges wear goofy robes. Kind of like the Supreme Court justices in the US still do. So this dude here is a fancy judge. He's in charge of applying the laws in a whole district of France. And he is wealthy enough to wear a sick, cool silk robe and have weirdly identical servants walk around beside him while he rides around on his fancy horse. So this is also another middle class. But unlike in England, where it's commoners who have been allowed to move up and occupy a kind of middle rung, the French have instead made it easier for wealthy commoners to buy their way into the nobility. So rather than accepting that commoners can occupy a position of status in society, they've instead decided to open up the ranks of the nobility to people who can buy their way in. Yes?
How much do they cost?
It's expensive, but it lasts for a lifetime.
Is that like a subscription service and a monthly payment?
It's probably a good investment. If I was back in the day and I had the cash, I would have probably bought my way into the French nobility and then tried to get sick government jobs that don't actually require me to do very much.
Like being a teacher.
Like being a teacher. You know me. Okay. So those are the two different new types of elite that emerged during this time period. On the one hand, you've got the English gentry. On the other hand, you've got the French nobility of the road. This is an interesting policy for the French state. On the one hand, they make tons of money up front by selling titles of nobility. They are making thousands and thousands of dollars on each title of nobility they issue. On the other hand, though, this kind of annoys the old-fashioned nobles because the old-fashioned nobles feel like this is like watering down what it means to be a noble. It's becoming less exclusive. And this is giving all these new folks tax exemption and legal exemption. So while it's a good way to raise money in the short term, in the long term, what this is doing is this is allowing way more people to get out of paying taxes later on in life, which is not going to be great for French finances in about 100 years, which is going to help lead to the French Revolution. Yes?
Wait, I'm so confused. Like, why do they even get to be exempt from taxes in the first place? Like, what's the benefit?
Well, so in the old feudal structure of France, the French nobility would pay a little bit of money to the king, but they would mostly serve the king by fighting. All of the big nobles would be warlords who ruled over their territory in France and then could provide military units to the King of France if he needed them. So your job is to keep your part of France on lock, govern it as best you can, and when I call on you, you need to be ready to roll with 200 armored knights. Let's go. That is how you pay the King of France. You pay with services rather than cash. Now, as the King of France has become more powerful, and as the feudal structure has fallen away, that old form of service is no longer super useful. But you would need to put new laws in place that would allow you to directly tax the nobles. And if you say to your nobles, guess what, guys? I've decided that I'm raising your taxes, and you all just have to accept it. The nobles still have in their possession private armies and fortresses. So the risk of increasing taxes on nobles is that you will have a noble rebellion on your hands. So the King of France decided to just ignore that issue, to let the nobles keep their tax-exempt status, and to focus instead on taxing the bejesus out of all the commoners in France. And the commoners in France see their taxes go up and up and up and up to the point where, like, they are barely able, like the average French peasant is barely able to eke out an existence because the entire surplus is being scraped away by the French state. So the French state is going to try to modernize and centralize without taxing its richest people, the state, or the church, and the nobles. This is ultimately going to lead to the French Revolution because the French state is going to be massively in debt and they're going to have to tax the nobles. And the nobles are going to be like, no, you can't make us. And they're going to do that over and over and over again until the French state is literally on the verge of collapse. And then it's going to collapse. Right. So a lot of different periods of history can be understood by rich people not wanting to pay taxes. The American Revolution was rich people not wanting to pay taxes. The decline of the Roman Republic was rich people who owned massive numbers of slaves not wanting to redistribute their land. The rise of the Republican Party since the 1980s has largely been rich people not wanting to pay taxes. French Revolution. There's people not wanting to pay taxes. All right, so anyway. Thoughts or questions about this before we move on? Cool. Next. So during this time period is a period of serious commoner unrest, both in the countryside and in the cities. As we've already said, life is getting harder during this time period for the average working class person. Even though we're seeing all of these cool advances in like art and government and warfare and technology, the average peasant is finding it harder to pay their bills and feed their kids than in 1350. Because there's more people trying to suck the same amount of food out of the same amount of land. So in the rural areas, you see lots of peasant uprisings. This has to do with increasing inequality in the villages. The poor peasants are remembering the good old days back when they owned land and now they don't. Nobles are continuing to apply old-fashioned feudal laws that no longer make that much sense. Like still rounding up peasants and forcing them to work on like the local road, which is seeming more and more barbaric. All sorts of religious changes led to social revolution. The most famous example is the Peasant Wars, which we looked at in Germany, where the peasants say, didn't Jesus say we're all equal? And Luther says, kill them. Kill them now. So that's what's going on in the countryside. In the city, bread is becoming more expensive. The price of grain is going up, therefore the price of bread is going up. And urban workers don't like this because they literally spend somewhere between 1/3 to 2/3 of their salary just on bread. Literally just on bread. So this is happening for a number of reasons. First of all, wages are going down because there's more workers looking for the same amount of work. Second, it's harder to move up in the world because the guilds are becoming more exclusive. And there are long-lasting and ever-worsening grain shortages. So there's more people trying to buy up the same amount of grain, or even a smaller amount of grain, and there's fewer chances for them to ever move out of that situation of precarity. And so something that you would get very frequently was something known as a bread riot. So during the summer months before the harvest, when grain supplies were low, bakers would raise the price of bread because they only had a certain amount of grain was getting more expensive for them to acquire, and so the price of bread would go up. If the price of bread ever got too high, it was very normal for the peasants to just say, nope, and just break into the bakers and like pin the baker up against the wall and just throw the bread out of the crowd, and then they would pay what they thought was a fair price for the bread. So they'd put a couple pennies. Yeah, they'd be like, there you go. They would pay the just price. And very frequently, nobody was punished for this because urban authorities thought that it was better to let the crowd take it out on the bakers than to have a clash between the city militia and angry, hungry housewives. Because you know who's going to win that. Yeah.
So you said that they spent 2/3 of their income on bread.
Yeah.
So was like housing cheap at the time?
Yeah,
or?
housing was pretty cheap, but also people were willing to just live in utter squalor. Yeah. 2/3 would only be during periods of shortage, but half was normal for like the lowest class of workers. It'd be like you get a place to sleep with your work. You like sleep in a shed, and you eat bread, and maybe like cabbage soup on a good day. Yeah. You catch rats in your free time to add to your soup. Okay, next. So last thing I wanted to talk to you guys about today was common popular culture. So the stuff that made the average poor person's life good was usually all the stuff that Erasmus wanted to get rid of, and that many of the Protestant reformers did get rid of. So here are the things that made life fun. Feast days. There were over like 100 saint feast days on the Catholic calendar in which you didn't have to go to work and there would usually be free beer somewhere. Carnival and Lent, which we already talked about. But Carnival was a big week-long celebration. And then Lent was a period of time when food was really expensive anyway, so it wasn't too hard to give up eating fancy food during that time period. Pilgrimage was a good way to have a vacation. There were hostels and monasteries all along famous pilgrimage routes, like the route to Canterbury Cathedral or to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, where you could get free food and lodging as you made your pilgrimage. And then also, if you ever got sick, you could rely on magic and spirits and demons and devil worship to, cure your sick baby or whatever. These are all things that the Protestants strove to eliminate and mostly successfully did. Whereas in Catholic countries, they do persist. So in France, where the Great Cat Massacre takes place, all of these things will still be in place. For entertainment, peasants did a lot of things. These are also things that Protestant reformers tried to get rid of. So public music, public dancing, and theater, including Shakespearean theater in England, were all things that commoners were able to engage in. Shakespeare would write his plays to appeal to all levels of society. He would have sex jokes and bloody sword fights for the commoners, and then he would have, reflections on mortality and ethics for the highborn. Not that people didn't like bloody sword fights from all classes, but they were the groundlings who can get in for a penny and throw stuff at the actors. Also, peasants and urban workers loved torturing animals for fun. Torturing animals for fun was a standard practice. Here are some of the most popular ones. Dog fighting would have been common. Okay, but so a very popular game in early modern London was called cock throwing. And so what you would do is you would chain a rooster up in the middle of the street, and then you would stand a certain distance away, and you would have a special weighted stick. And you would hang out with your buddies and eat and drink, and take turns throwing this weighted stick at the rooster.
Would you eat the rooster out?
Yep. And so you'd all go in on it. You'd all buy the rooster together. You'd go to the market, buy a big fat rooster, chain him up, and whoever actually killed the rooster with the throw got to keep it.
Thank you for the dead rooster.
Yep. So and just imagine. So by the end, as you and your friends are all getting progressively more drunk, the rooster is probably just a bloody mess on the. On the street, but it's not quite dead yet. You gotta really get a solid blow to lights out, right? So another one was called fox tossing, which was after you caught a fox, you would get a big guy or a couple big guys, and you get them to throw the fox as high up into the air as possible, and see if you could kill it just by having it fall back down. And one of the most popular ones was bear baiting. Bear baiting would often be held in the same theaters that had Shakespearean performances, because the round arena could also be used like a coliseum. And how it would work is you'd have a bear that was captured live, and you'd bring it in and stake it in the middle and chain it up. And then you would unleash progressive waves of hunting dogs against the bear. And so you'd start by maybe releasing a couple, and then the bear would just murder those dogs, but get bit up a little bit, and then you'd be all right, and then you'd release the really big mastiffs, and then you'd watch the bear and the mastiffs go at it. And there are primary sources saying Samuel Pepys, who was writing in the 1600s, was it was a very relaxing afternoon. I cannot think of a more pleasant sight than the hounds courageously charging the bear, and the bear mad with rage. Very pleasant. Yes.
It's like the zombie video game.
Yeah, it's like the zombie video game. It's like Horde mode in Gears of War 2. But so all of that this is all to set you guys up for Great Cat Massacre. Torturing animals was standard lower class fun. And it still is today in some countries. Cockfighting is still quite popular in Mexico. Bullfights are still quite popular in parts of Latin America and Spain, and these are bloody affairs. My friends went to one in Ecuador. I didn't go to it, And they said they had never seen so much blood. Because this is a bull being slowly bled to death. It's like running around, like bleeding from the mouth until it's eventually stabbed through the back and through the heart. And so this is a serious, like almost sacrificial event. And the peasants love it. So when it comes to murdering a bunch of cats for fun, it's not necessarily out of the realm of normal everyday experience for working class Parisians. All right, so that's all the time we have for today. I'm sorry we didn't get to the test. We will. I will give you the test now, and we can go over it at a later point. Thank you.